I don't care who you think you are. Someone like you doesn't belong in a seat worth $20,000. Those words would echo through Captain Richard Hayes' mind for months to come, but right now he was still blissfully unaware that he was about to destroy his own life with a single conversation. The morning of March 15th had started like any other at JFK International Airport, with the usual chaos of early morning departures and the gentle hum of anticipation that fills every terminal before the day's journeys begin. Dr. Olivia Rose stood at gate 47, watching her 8-year-old daughter Maya press her face against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, marveling at the Boeing 777 that would take them across the Atlantic. Maya's breath fogged the glass as she traced the outline of the aircraft with her small finger, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that only children possess when faced with something truly magnificent. "Mom, look how big it is," Maya whispered, her voice filled with awe as she pointed to the Meridian Airways plane. "Do you think it's scary to be the pilot of something so huge?" Olivia smiled softly, adjusting the hood of her gray sweatshirt as she moved to stand beside her daughter. To any casual observer, they looked like a typical mother and daughter heading out on vacation. Nothing more, nothing less. Olivia wore her favorite charcoal hoodie, the one that had seen her through countless late-night coding sessions in her early days as a tech entrepreneur, paired with comfortable jeans and well-worn sneakers that had walked through boardrooms worth billions without anyone ever suspecting their owner's true identity. Maya looked every bit the excited child in her simple purple dress and white sneakers, clutching a small backpack that contained her coloring book's tablet and the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3 years old. There was nothing about either of them that screamed wealth or power, which was exactly how Olivia preferred it. She had learned long ago that the most effective negotiations happened when people underestimated you, and today's trip to London was supposed to be a celebration of the biggest deal of her career. 72 hours ago, Olivia had completed the acquisition of Meridian Airways in a transaction so carefully orchestrated that even the airline's own board members didn't know the identity of their new owner. The paperwork wouldn't be filed publicly until Monday morning, which meant that for the next 4 days, she was technically flying on an airline she owned while maintaining complete anonymity. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could probably buy every other airline at JFK if she wanted to, but right now she was just another passenger waiting to board Flight MA 2847 to London Heathrow. "I bet the pilot has to study really hard to learn how to fly something this big." Maya continued, her imagination clearly running wild with possibilities. "Do you think he has to take tests like I do at school?" "Probably even harder tests," Olivia replied, pulling their boarding passes from her pocket and checking the gate information one more time. Seat 1A and 1B in first class. She had specifically requested the seats directly behind the cockpit, not for the luxury, but because Maya had asked if they could sit as close to the flying part as possible. It was supposed to be a special treat, a mother-daughter bonding experience before Olivia got buried in the meetings that would determine the future direction of her newest acquisition. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of negotiations, legal documents, and strategic planning sessions that had left Olivia exhausted but exhilarated. She had started her company 15 years ago in her college dorm room building, educational software that helped children with learning disabilities access the same opportunities as their peers. What began as a passion project had grown into a technology empire worth over $8 billion with contracts in 47 countries, and a reputation for innovation that had made her one of the most sought-after advisors in the tech industry. But success had come with sacrifices, and lately, Olivia had been feeling the weight of all the time she'd spent building her business instead of building memories with Maya. This trip was supposed to change that, a chance for them to explore London together, visit museums, take boat rides on the Thames, and just enjoy being mother and daughter without the constant interruption of phone calls and board meetings. Maya pressed her nose against the window again, watching the ground crew load luggage into the cargo hold of their plane. "Mom, why do some people get to go on the airplane first?" Is it because they're more important? The question stopped Olivia in her tracks, the innocent curiosity in her daughter's voice highlighting something that she herself had been thinking about more and more lately. Maya was 8 years old, bright and observant, and she was starting to notice the inequalities that most adults simply accepted as normal parts of life. How do you explain to a child that, yes, some people do get treated better than others, often for reasons that have nothing to do with their character or their contributions to society? Well, sweetheart, Olivia said, carefully, choosing her words with the precision she usually reserved for contract negotiations. Sometimes people pay extra money for certain conveniences like getting on the plane first or having more comfortable seats. But that doesn't make them more important as human beings. Everyone on that plane, whether they're sitting in the front or the back, deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. Maya nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that she brought to all new concepts. So, even if someone doesn't have a lot of money, they should still be treated nicely. Especially then. Olivia confirmed, feeling a surge of pride at her daughter's instinctive sense of fairness. Remember what we always say about how we treat people. Judge people by their character, not their cover. Maya recited a phrase that Olivia had been teaching her since she was old enough to understand the concepts of fairness and justice. As they spoke, the gate area began to fill with other passengers preparing for the London flight. Olivia observed them with the analytical mind that had made her successful in business, noting the subtle hierarchies and social dynamics that played out in airport waiting areas. There were the obvious first-class passengers, well-dressed business travelers with expensive luggage and confident postures that suggested they were accustomed to getting their way. There were families like hers, middle-class travelers who had saved for months or used frequent flyer miles to afford a special trip. And there were the budget travelers clutching their economy boarding passes and hoping their carry-on bags wouldn't be flagged for size violations. The boarding announcement crackled over the gate speakers, starting with the usual hierarchy that Maya had noticed. First class passengers, business class, then the various economy groups based on ticket type and loyalty status. Olivia gathered their belongings and took Maya's hand as they joined the first-class boarding line, a group of about 20 passengers who looked like they belonged in a Fortune 500 boardroom or a country club dining room. Now boarding all first-class passengers for flight MA2847 to London Heathrow, the gate agent announced, and Olivia felt Maya's hand squeeze hers with excitement. As they approached the gate agent, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who looked to be in her early 20s, Olivia noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone who was new to her job. Sarah's movements were precise but slightly nervous, and she examined each boarding pass with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to make any mistakes. "Good morning," Sarah said warmly as she scanned their boarding passes. "Welcome aboard Flight MA2847. You'll be in seats 1A and 1B today, our premier first-class accommodations. Is this your first time flying with Meridian Airways?" Maya beamed at the attention. "It's my first time flying first class anywhere. Mom said we're celebrating something special." Sarah's smile became genuine as she looked down at Maya. "How exciting. I hope you have a wonderful flight. The crew will take excellent care of you both." As they walked down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, Maya chattered excitedly about everything she saw. The other passengers, the airport workers visible through the windows, the massive size of the plane as they got closer. Olivia found herself relaxing for the first time in months, letting go of the constant mental calculations and strategic planning that usually occupied her mind. This was exactly what she needed. Time to just be Maya's mom without the weight of running a multi-billion-dollar empire. They stepped onto the plane where the first-class cabin greeted them with an atmosphere of hushed luxury. The seats were more like small apartments, each one equipped with a lie-flat bed, a large entertainment screen, and enough storage space for all the amenities that wealthy travelers expected. Maya's eyes widened as she took in the space, clearly impressed by the level of comfort that most people never experienced when they flew. "Mom," "This is like a hotel room with windows," Maya whispered, not wanting to disturb the other passengers who were settling into their seats. Olivia helped Maya stow her backpack and get comfortable in seat 1B, making sure she could reach the entertainment system and had everything she needed for the 8-hour flight. As she settled into seat 1A, Olivia felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the luxury of the accommodations. This was her plane now, her company, her responsibility to ensure that every passenger had a safe and comfortable journey. In just a few days, she would begin implementing the changes that would transform Meridian Airways from a struggling legacy carrier into a model for what the aviation industry could become. But for now, she was content to be just another passenger enjoying a special trip with her daughter and looking forward to a week of museums, theater, and all the cultural experiences that London had to offer. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour everything would change, and this flight would become the catalyst for a transformation that neither she nor the airline industry would ever forget. Captain Richard Hayes had been flying for Meridian Airways for 28 years, and in all that time he had never questioned his right to make judgments about who belonged where. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told he was wrong about anything that mattered. His silver hair perfectly styled beneath his captain's hat and his uniform pressed to military precision. Hayes represented everything that was both impressive and problematic about the old guard of commercial aviation. Technically excellent, completely self-assured, and utterly convinced that his experience gave him the authority to decide who deserved respect and who did not. As he completed his pre-flight inspection of the Boeing 777, Hayes moved through the cabin with the practiced eye of someone who viewed the aircraft as his personal kingdom. He checked the emergency equipment, reviewed the passenger manifest, and made mental notes about anything that might require his attention during the flight. But what Hayes was really doing, though he would never admit it even to himself, was conducting his own private assessment of whether the passengers met his personal standards for first-class travel. Hayes had grown up in a small town in Montana where everyone looked like him, thought like him, and shared his assumptions about how the world should work. His father had been a crop duster, his grandfather a barnstormer, and Hayes had inherited their belief that aviation was a noble profession that attracted a certain type of person, meaning people who looked and sounded like the Hayes family. He had joined Meridian Airways straight out of the Air Force back in the days when commercial pilots were treated like celebrities and passengers dressed up for flights like they were attending church. Those days were long gone, of course, and Hayes often found himself lamenting the decline of what he called standards in commercial aviation. What he meant by standards, though he would never say it out loud, was his discomfort with the increasing diversity of both passengers and crew members. Hayes had learned to keep his opinions to himself, at least officially, but that didn't stop him from making mental notes about passengers who didn't fit his narrow definition of who belonged in premium cabins. As he entered the first-class section, Hayes nodded approvingly at most of what he saw. Senator Blackwood's son Trevor was settling into seat 2A, his expensive suit and obvious sense of entitlement marking him as Hayes's preferred type of first-class passenger. There was Mrs. Patterson, the pharmaceutical heiress, in her usual seat, 3F, and Mr. Chang, the investment banker, whose company had a corporate contract with Meridian Airways. These were people Hayes understood people who looked and acted like they belonged in the rarefied air of premium cabin service. But when his eyes landed on seats 1A and 1B, Hayes felt a familiar surge of irritation that he had trained himself to recognize and act upon. A black woman in a hoodie and jeans, accompanied by a young black girl, were occupying the two most prestigious seats on his aircraft. Hayes's first instinct was that there had been some kind of mistake. Surely these two passengers had wandered into the wrong section, or were seated incorrectly due to a computer error. Hayes had perfected the art of disguising his prejudices as concern for proper procedures and airline standards. He never used overtly racist language, at least not where anyone could hear him, but he had developed a sophisticated vocabulary for expressing his biases in ways that sounded professional and reasonable. In his mind, he wasn't discriminating against anyone. He was simply maintaining the level of service and atmosphere that first-class passengers expected and deserved. He made his way to the galley where Sarah Chen was preparing for the departure service. Sarah had been with Meridian Airways for only 6 months, and Hayes had already marked her as someone who needed more guidance about maintaining proper cabin standards. In his view, young flight attendants often lacked the judgment to recognize when passengers didn't fit the first-class demographic. "Sarah," Hayes said, his voice carrying the tone of authority that he had cultivated over decades of command. "I need you to double-check the passengers in 1A and 1B. There might be a seating error that needs to be corrected before we take off." Sarah looked confused as she glanced at her tablet, which displayed the passenger manifest and seating assignments. "Sir, I have Dr. Rose and her daughter, Maya, confirmed in those seats. Their boarding passes scanned correctly and their tickets are properly validated for first-class service." Hayes frowned, his suspicion deepening rather than being resolved by Sarah's confirmation. "Doctor Rose? What kind of doctor? And how exactly did she come by first-class tickets?" The questions carried an undertone of skepticism that suggested Hayes didn't believe someone who looked like Olivia could legitimately afford premium accommodations. "I don't have her professional details in the manifest, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the respectful tone that junior crew members used when speaking to senior captains. "But her tickets show full fare payment, not an upgrade or a frequent flyer redemption. Is there something specific you'd like me to verify?" What Hayes wanted to verify was his assumption that Olivia and Maya didn't belong in first class, but he couldn't say that directly. Instead, he had to find other ways to express his discomfort with their presence. "Sometimes the booking system makes errors, especially with discount tickets or third-party bookings. I've seen situations where passengers end up in seats they didn't actually pay for, and it creates problems when the rightful passengers board." Sarah nodded, though she privately wondered why the captain was so concerned about 2 passengers who clearly had valid tickets and weren't causing any disturbances. "Should I ask to see their receipts or contact the gate agent for verification?" "Not yet." Hayes said, his mind already working through the options available to him. "Let me handle this personally. I want to make sure we don't have any complications once we're airborne." As Sarah returned to her pre-flight duties, Hayes continued his inspection, but his attention remained focused on the passengers in seats 1A and 1B. He watched as Maya excitedly explored the entertainment system while her mother helped her get settled, and something about their obvious comfort and familiarity with the first-class environment only deepened his suspicion that they were somehow taking advantage of a system error. Hayes had convinced himself over the years that his concerns about passenger appropriateness were really about maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that first-class travelers expected. He told himself that people paid premium prices, not just for larger seats and better food, but for the assurance that they would be surrounded by others of their own social and economic status. In his mind, allowing the wrong people into first class was a form of false advertising that undermined the value proposition of premium service. The irony, of course, was that Hayes had no idea he was looking at someone who could buy his airline without affecting her monthly budget, someone whose technology companies had revolutionized industries and whose philanthropic work had improved the lives of millions of children around the world. All he saw was a black woman in casual clothing, and his prejudices filled in the rest of the story with assumptions that revealed far more about his own character than hers. Trevor Blackwood chose that moment to signal for service, snapping his fingers with the kind of casual arrogance that immediately earned Hayes' approval. Trevor was exactly the type of passenger that Hayes believed belonged in first class. Young, white, wealthy, and completely confident in his right to demand attention and service from people he considered his social inferiors. "Captain," Trevor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I wanted to thank you personally for accommodating me on this flight. My father sends his regards, and he mentioned that you might be interested in the aviation committee position that's opening up next year." Hayes beamed, his chest swelling with pride at the recognition from someone connected to political power. Senator Blackwood is a true friend to the aviation industry. I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity might be helpful. This was the kind of passenger interaction that Hayes lived for. Recognition from people who mattered, acknowledgement of his status, and importance confirmation that he belonged in the same social circles as senators and their families. The contrast between his warm, deferential treatment of Trevor and his suspicious scrutiny of Olivia couldn't have been more stark, but Hayes was blind to his own double standards. As the boarding process continued, Hayes found himself returning again and again to observe the passengers in seats 1A and 1B, each glance reinforcing his conviction that something was wrong with their presence in his first-class cabin. He began formulating a plan for addressing the situation, telling himself that he was protecting the airline's reputation and ensuring customer satisfaction for the passengers who truly belonged in premium accommodations. Hayes had no way of knowing that his next conversation would be recorded by multiple passengers, uploaded to social media within hours, and viewed by millions of people around the world. He had no idea that his assumptions and prejudices were about to collide with a reality so far beyond his comprehension that it would destroy everything he had built over nearly 3 decades of flying. All he knew was that he had the authority to decide who belonged where on his aircraft, and he was about to exercise that authority in a way that felt completely justified and absolutely necessary. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change not just Hayes's life, but the entire culture of commercial aviation. The moment Captain Hayes approached seats 1A and 1B, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted like the air pressure change before a storm. Olivia sensed his presence before she looked up, some instinct honed by years of navigating boardrooms and negotiations, alerting her that trouble was heading her way. Maya was absorbed in setting up her tablet, completely unaware that their peaceful morning was about to be shattered by an encounter that would teach her hard lessons about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn. "Excuse me," Hayes said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that was designed to make people feel small and uncertain. He stood directly in front of Olivia's seat, his imposing frame blocking her view of the cabin and creating a sense of being trapped that was entirely intentional. "I need to see your boarding passes." Olivia looked up from her laptop, taking in the captain's stern expression and aggressive posture. She had dealt with men like Hayes her entire professional life, men who assumed they could intimidate her into compliance simply by virtue of their position and their willingness to make a scene. "Is there a problem, Captain?" she asked, her voice calm and measured despite the warning bells going off in her head. Maya looked up from her tablet, confusion creeping across her face as she registered the tension in the interaction. "Mom, what's wrong? Did we do something bad?" The innocence in Maya's question should have given Hayes pause, should have reminded him that he was speaking to a mother and child who were simply trying to enjoy their flight. Instead, it only reinforced his conviction that these passengers were somehow out of place and needed to be dealt with firmly. "I'm just verifying that everyone is in their proper seats," he said, extending his hand with an expectation of immediate compliance. "Boarding passes, please." Olivia reached into her pocket and produced their boarding passes, handing them to Hayes with a steady hand, despite her growing awareness that this situation was about to escalate beyond a simple misunderstanding. She watched his face as he examined the documents, noting the way his frown deepened as he realized that the tickets were completely legitimate and properly issued. Hayes held the boarding passes up to the light, a theatrical gesture designed to suggest that he suspected forgery or fraud. Several other passengers had begun to notice the commotion, their conversations dying away as they turned to watch the drama unfolding in the front row of the cabin. "These seats were reserved for VIP passengers," Hayes announced, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone in first class could hear. "There seems to be some kind of booking error that needs to be corrected." "I assure you there's no error," Olivia replied, her tone remaining professional, even as her protective instincts began to activate. Maya was looking back and forth between her mother and the captain, her 8-year-old mind struggling to understand why the pilot was being mean to them when they hadn't done anything wrong. Hayes leaned closer, invading Olivia's personal space in a way that was designed to make her feel threatened and uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I don't know how you obtained these tickets or what kind of upgrade scam you're running, but I can't allow unauthorized passengers to occupy premium seating. You're going to need to gather your belongings and move to your actual assigned seats in economy." The word scam hung in the air like a slap, its implications clear to everyone within earshot. Hayes was essentially accusing Olivia of theft, suggesting that she had somehow stolen or fraudulently obtained tickets that she couldn't possibly afford. The accusation was based on nothing more than his assessment of her appearance and his assumptions about what kind of person belonged in first class. Maya tugged on her mother's sleeve, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that the captain was trying to make them leave their seats. "Mom, I thought you said we earned these seats by working hard. Why is he saying we're not supposed to be here?" The question cut through Olivia like a knife, highlighting the impossible position that Hayes had put her in. How do you explain to a child that some adults judge people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character? How do you maintain a child's faith in fairness and justice when confronted with such blatant prejudice disguised as authority? "Captain Hayes," Olivia said, reading his name tag with deliberate precision. "My daughter and I have valid tickets for these seats. We paid full fare, we're not causing any disturbances, and we're simply trying to enjoy our flight. I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing here, but you're frightening a child and creating a scene that's entirely unnecessary." Hayes straightened up, his face flushing with anger at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his station. "Ma'am, I am the captain of this aircraft, and my word is law while we're on this plane. Under FAA regulations, I have the authority to remove any passenger who I determine to be a disruptive influence or a security risk." The threat was clear, and several passengers gasped at the escalation. Hayes was essentially threatening to have Olivia arrested and removed from the plane, all because she had dared to question his authority and refused to accept his unfounded accusations. The situation had moved far beyond a simple seating dispute and had become something much more dangerous and humiliating. Trevor Blackwood, who had been watching the confrontation with obvious enjoyment, chose that moment to insert himself into the situation. "Captain Hayes, if there's a seating problem, I'd be happy to help resolve it. My assistant made backup reservations in case we needed them." Hayes turned toward Trevor with a smile, his demeanor completely transformed when addressing someone he considered worthy of respect. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Blackwood. I think we can work something out once we get these passengers moved to their appropriate accommodations." The contrast between Hayes's treatment of Trevor and his treatment of Olivia was so stark that even some of the other first-class passengers began to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Patterson, the pharmaceutical heiress, whispered something to her traveling companion, while Mr. Chang pulled out his phone and began recording the interaction. Olivia realized that she had reached a crossroads where any response she chose would teach Maya a different lesson about how to navigate a world that wasn't always fair or just. She could reveal her identity and watch Hayes crumble with embarrassment, but that would teach Maya that power and wealth were the only ways to command respect. She could demand to speak to the ground supervisor and escalate the situation through official channels, but that would delay the flight and punish innocent passengers for Hayes's prejudice. Or she could choose dignity and grace, showing Maya that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is to maintain your composure and let your character speak for itself. It was a choice that would cost them comfort and convenience, but it might preserve something more valuable: the lesson that no one can take away your self-respect unless you let them. Maya was now crying openly, confused and frightened by the aggressive behavior of someone who was supposed to be taking care of their safety. "Why is he being so mean to us, Mom? What did we do wrong?" Olivia gathered her daughter into her arms, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "We didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes adults make poor choices based on things that don't matter, like how people look or dress. But we can't control other people's choices. We can only control our own. She stood up, helping Maya collect her belongings while maintaining eye contact with Hayes. Captain, we'll move to whatever seats you assign us. But I want you to remember this moment because you're about to learn something important about making assumptions based on appearances. Hayes smirked, interpreting Olivia's compliance as an admission of guilt rather than an act of grace. I'm glad we could resolve this quickly and professionally. Sarah will escort you to your proper seats and make sure you're comfortable. As Olivia and Maya gathered their belongings, the other passengers watched in stunned silence. Some looked embarrassed by the scene they had witnessed, while others seemed to approve of Hayes's actions. But all of them would remember this moment when the truth was finally revealed and they would have to confront their own complicity in allowing such treatment to go unchallenged. The walk from seat 1A to the economy cabin was one of the longest journeys Olivia had ever taken, not because of the physical distance, but because of the weight of her daughter's tears and the knowledge that Maya was learning lessons about the world that no parent wants to teach. As they passed through the business class and premium economy sections, other passengers stared with curiosity and judgment, some whispering about what the black woman and her daughter must have done to be escorted out of first class. Maya clung to her mother's hand, trying to be brave, but clearly shaken by an experience that had destroyed her innocent faith in the fairness of the adult world. Mom, will we be in trouble when we get to London? Will they think we're bad people too? Olivia squeezed her daughter's hand, her heart breaking at the questions that revealed how deeply this humiliation had affected Maya's sense of safety and belonging in the world. No, sweetheart. We're not bad people and we're not in trouble. Sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes teach important lessons. As they settled into seats 42A and 42B in economy, surrounded by the cramped conditions and indifferent service that characterized the back of the plane, Olivia made a silent promise to herself and her daughter. This humiliation would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a transformation that would ensure no other child would have to experience what Maya had just endured. Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit completely satisfied with his handling of the situation and utterly unaware that he had just set in motion events that would destroy his career and change the airline industry forever. The economy cabin of Flight MA2847 was a stark contrast to the spacious luxury that Maya had been so excited to experience just 30 minutes earlier. Seats 42A and 42B were located in the very back of the plane, near the restrooms and galley, where the constant foot traffic and service noise created an environment that was neither peaceful nor comfortable. The seats themselves were narrow and tightly packed, designed to maximize revenue per square foot rather than passenger comfort, and Maya's legs barely reached the floor as she settled into her assigned spot. Mr. Harold Wilson, the elderly gentleman in seat 42C, looked up from his crossword puzzle as Olivia and Maya squeezed into their seats, his kind eyes immediately registering their distress. At 73 years old, Harold had flown enough to recognize the signs of passengers who had been displaced or mistreated, and something about the way Maya was trying not to cry told him that this mother and daughter had experienced something far worse than a simple booking mix-up. First time being bumped from first class? Harold asked gently, his voice carrying the wisdom and understanding that comes from decades of watching people navigate the inequalities of air travel. Happened to me once back in the 80s. Airlines can be pretty ruthless when it comes to accommodating their VIP passengers. Olivia helped Maya buckle her seatbelt, her mind racing with emotions that ranged from protective anger to strategic calculation. She had built her entire career on the principle of remaining calm under pressure and thinking several moves ahead of her opponents, but watching her daughter's confusion and hurt had triggered something deeper than business instincts. This wasn't about market competition or negotiating tactics. This was about dignity, respect, and the lessons she was teaching Maya about how to respond when the world treats you unfairly. Something like that, Olivia replied, not wanting to go into details that might upset Maya further. We're fine back here, though. Sometimes the most interesting conversations happen in economy. Maya wiped her eyes and looked around the cabin, taking in the diverse group of passengers who surrounded them. There were families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, business travelers working on laptops, and students who had clearly saved for months to afford this trip to London. These were people who worked hard for their money, who planned and sacrificed for opportunities to travel, who deserved the same respect and consideration as anyone sitting in first class. "Mom," Maya whispered, leaning close so that only Olivia could hear. "Why did that pilot man think we didn't belong in the nice seats? We did everything right, didn't we?" The question went straight to the heart of everything that Olivia had been thinking about during their humiliating march to the back of the plane. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some people judge others based on skin color, clothing, or assumptions about socioeconomic status? How do you maintain a child's faith in justice and fairness while preparing her for a world that doesn't always operate according to those principles? "Sometimes, sweetheart," Olivia said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that this conversation would shape Maya's understanding of the world for years to come. People make decisions based on things that don't really matter, like how someone looks or dresses or where they come from. It's not right and it's not fair, but it happens. The important thing is that we don't let other people's mistakes change who we are or how we treat people. Maya nodded, solemnly processing this information with the seriousness that she brought to all of her mother's explanations about complex adult concepts. "So he was wrong about us." "He was very wrong about us," Olivia confirmed, pulling her laptop out of her bag and setting it up on the tiny tray table that was barely large enough to hold a cup of coffee. "And sometimes when people are wrong about important things, they need to learn lessons that help them make better choices in the future." As Olivia powered up her computer, she wasn't thinking about checking emails or reviewing presentation slides. Instead, she was accessing a secure portal that very few people in the world even knew existed, the executive command system for Meridian Airways that had been installed as part of her due diligence process during the acquisition. With a few keystrokes, she could access real-time flight data, crew schedules, passenger manifests, and financial records for every aircraft in the Meridian fleet. Harold Wilson, who had been quietly observing their interaction, leaned over with the kind of grandfatherly concern that immediately put Maya at ease. "What's your name, young lady? I'm Harold, and I've been flying on planes since before your mom was born." Maya smiled for the first time since leaving first class, grateful for the kindness in Harold's voice. "I'm Maya, and this is my mom, Dr. Rose. We were going to sit in the fancy seats, but the pilot said we couldn't." "Well, Maya," Harold said with a conspiratorial whisper, "let me tell you a secret about flying. The view from the window is exactly the same whether you're sitting in first class or economy, and the most interesting people are usually back here with us regular folks." As Harold engaged Maya in conversation about her upcoming trip to London, Olivia navigated through the Meridian Airways executive interface, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years managing complex technology platforms. What she was looking for were Captain Hayes's personnel records, performance evaluations, and any previous incidents that might indicate a pattern of discriminatory behavior. What she found was even worse than she had expected. Hayes's file contained 3 separate complaints from crew members about inappropriate comments and hostile work environment issues, all of which had been dismissed by management as personality conflicts or communication style differences. There were 2 formal grievances from passengers who had felt discriminated against during Hayes's flights, both resolved through private settlements and non-disclosure agreements that kept the incidents out of public view. Most damning of all was a series of performance evaluations that praised Hayes's technical flying skills while noting his old-school approach to customer service and his strong opinions about maintaining traditional standards. Reading between the lines, it was clear that Meridian Airways management knew exactly what kind of person Hayes was, but had chosen to protect him because of his seniority and his reputation as a skilled pilot. Olivia picked up her phone and sent a carefully worded text message to her chief legal officer. Initiate Protocol 0 for Flight M, A2847. Track all communications record, all incidents, document everything. Do not intervene yet. Let this play out naturally, but make sure we have a complete record of everything that happens. Protocol 0 was something that Olivia had developed years ago when she first started dealing with hostile takeovers and corporate sabotage attempts. It created a comprehensive documentation system that captured every detail of a developing situation, providing ironclad evidence for whatever legal or business actions might become necessary. She had never thought she would need to use it during a commercial flight, but Hayes's behavior had crossed lines that demanded both immediate response and long-term consequences. Maya noticed her mother's serious expression as she worked on the laptop. "Mom, are you working? I thought this was supposed to be our special trip." Olivia closed the laptop and turned her full attention to her daughter, realizing that she had let her anger and strategic thinking override the most important priority, making sure that Maya felt safe and loved despite the trauma they had just experienced. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. This is our special trip, and nothing that happened back there changes that. I was just taking care of some business so that we can focus on having fun in London." Harold Wilson had been listening to their conversation with growing curiosity, particularly Olivia's references to business matters that seemed far more significant than anything a typical passenger would be dealing with during a flight. "If you don't mind me asking, Dr. Rose, what kind of work do you do? You seem to be handling this situation with the kind of calm that comes from dealing with much bigger problems than airline seating disputes." Olivia smiled, appreciating Harold's perceptiveness and his genuine concern for Maya's well-being. "I work in technology, mostly developing educational software and managing business operations. It's taught me that most problems have solutions if you're willing to look at them from the right angle and take appropriate action." Over the intercom system, Captain Hayes's voice filled the cabin with the kind of self-congratulatory announcement that pilots often made when they felt particularly pleased with themselves. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes from the flight deck. We've had a minor seating issue that has now been resolved, and I want to thank you all for your patience as we maintained our high standards of service for all passengers. We should be departing shortly for London, where the weather is clear, and the arrival will be smooth." Maya looked up at her mother with confusion. "He makes it sound like we did something wrong, but we didn't, did we?" "No, sweetheart, we didn't do anything wrong," Olivia replied, her voice carrying a note of steel that suggested this conversation was far from over. "Sometimes people tell stories that make them feel better about their own behavior, even when those stories aren't true." As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Olivia found herself observing everything with the analytical mind of someone who now owned responsibility for every aspect of the operation. She noticed the harried flight attendants in economy trying to serve 3 times as many passengers as their first-class colleagues, the broken overhead bins that hadn't been repaired, the cramped restroom facilities that were already showing signs of wear just minutes into the flight. This was the reality that Captain Hayes never saw from his position in the cockpit and his brief walks through the premium cabins. This was the experience that most of Meridian Airways customers actually received for their money. Overcrowded conditions, minimal service, and the clear message that their comfort and dignity were less important than maximizing revenue from every available inch of aircraft space. But Olivia also noticed something else that gave her hope for what the airline could become under her leadership. She saw the economy flight attendants going out of their way to help elderly passengers with their luggage, crew members taking extra time to comfort a nervous child, and the genuine kindness that most airline employees showed when they weren't constrained by policies that prioritized profit over people. As Flight MA2847 lifted off from JFK, and headed out over the Atlantic, Olivia made a silent promise that this experience would be the catalyst for changes that went far beyond punishing one prejudiced pilot. She was going to transform Meridian Airways into an example of what the airline industry could accomplish when it prioritized dignity, respect, and genuine customer service over the outdated hierarchies and discriminatory practices that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The humiliation that Hayes had inflicted on her and Maya was about to become the spark that ignited a revolution in commercial aviation. But first, there were more lessons to be learned and more evidence to be gathered. 3 hours into the flight, as Maya dozed fitfully against her mother's shoulder, and most of the economy passengers settled in for the long journey across the Atlantic, the first signs of serious trouble began to emerge from the first-class cabin. It started as raised voices that could be heard even over the constant hum of the jet engines, followed by the sound of something crashing, and then a woman's scream that cut through the ambient noise like a knife blade. Olivia felt Maya stir against her shoulder, her daughter's peaceful sleep interrupted by the commotion from the front of the plane. "Mom, what was that noise? Is everything okay?" Before Olivia could respond, Sarah Chen appeared in the economy aisle, moving quickly toward the first-class cabin with the kind of urgency that suggested a serious problem rather than a minor passenger complaint. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking slightly. Clear signs of someone who was dealing with a situation that was beyond her training and experience. Harold Wilson, who had been dozing in seat 42C, opened his eyes and listened to the continued sounds of conflict from the premium cabin. "That doesn't sound like a simple service issue," he observed quietly. "Someone's having a real problem up there." Olivia gently shifted Maya so that she could stand up and look toward the first-class section, her view blocked by the curtains and bulkhead walls that separated the different classes of service. But even without being able to see what was happening, she could hear enough to know that Trevor Blackwood was at the center of whatever chaos was unfolding. His voice was loud, slurred, and increasingly aggressive, suggesting that he had consumed far more alcohol than any responsible crew member should have allowed. "I don't care what your policies say." Trevor's voice carried clearly through the cabin, his words revealing the entitled rage of someone who wasn't accustomed to being told no. "Do you know who my father is? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're going to be in if you don't give me what I want?" Maya was fully awake now, looking up at her mother with the kind of worried expression that children get when they sense that the adults around them are losing control of a situation. "Mom, why is that man yelling? Is he going to hurt someone?" The question that every parent dreads: how do you explain to a child that some adults behave badly, especially when they have power or privilege that protects them from the normal consequences of their actions? Olivia could hear Sarah's voice responding to Trevor's threats, her tone professional but strained as she tried to de-escalate a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. "Sometimes when people drink too much alcohol, they don't make good choices," Olivia explained to Maya, choosing her words carefully to provide age-appropriate context without frightening her daughter further. "The flight attendants are trained to handle these situations, but it sounds like someone needs help." Another crash echoed through the cabin, followed by Sarah's voice raised in distress. "Sir, please step back. You're making me uncomfortable and I need you to return to your seat immediately." Olivia felt her protective instincts activate the same feeling she had experienced earlier when Captain Hayes was humiliating Maya in front of the other passengers. The difference was that now she understood the power dynamics at play on this aircraft, and she knew that Sarah Chen was facing the same kind of discriminatory treatment that she and Maya had experienced, but with the added danger of physical intimidation and alcohol-fueled aggression. She stood up, ignoring the seatbelt sign that was still illuminated, and began moving toward the first-class cabin. Several other passengers noticed her movement and began to pay closer attention to the sounds coming from the premium section, their conversations dying away as they realized that something serious was happening on their flight. "Mom, where are you going?" Maya asked, her voice carrying the edge of panic that children experience when they think they might be abandoned in a dangerous situation. "I'm going to help someone who needs help," Olivia replied, leaning down to speak directly to Maya while keeping one eye on the path toward first class. "Mr. Wilson is going to stay with you, and I'll be back in just a few minutes, okay?" Harold immediately understood the situation and moved to reassure Maya. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Your mom is very smart and very brave, and she knows what she's doing. Why don't you tell me more about what you want to see when you get to London?" As Olivia moved through the economy cabin, she passed flight attendants who were trying to pretend that nothing was wrong, their professional smiles failing to mask their awareness that a serious incident was unfolding in the premium section. The contrast between their forced cheerfulness and the obvious sounds of conflict created an atmosphere of tension that was affecting passengers throughout the aircraft. Pushing through the curtain that separated economy from premium economy, Olivia could hear Captain Hayes's voice joining the confrontation, but instead of de-escalating the situation or protecting his crew member, he seemed to be focusing his attention on calming Trevor rather than addressing his inappropriate behavior. "Mr. Blackwood, please have a seat." Hayes's voice carried the tone of someone who was desperately trying to manage a VIP passenger rather than enforce appropriate conduct standards. "I'm sure Sarah didn't mean to upset you. She's still learning our service protocols." The statement made Olivia's blood boil, revealing that Hayes was more concerned with protecting Trevor's feelings than ensuring Sarah's safety and dignity. It was exactly the same mentality that had led to their humiliation earlier in the flight. The assumption that some passengers deserved respect and protection, while others were expendable resources whose comfort and safety were secondary considerations. As she reached the boundary between business class and first class, Olivia could finally see what was happening in the premium cabin. Trevor Blackwood was standing unsteadily in the aisle, his expensive suit disheveled and his face flushed with alcohol and anger. Sarah Chen was backed against the galley counter, her uniform stained with what appeared to be red wine. Her professional composure cracking under the pressure of being trapped between an aggressive passenger and a captain who was more interested in protecting the airline's relationship with powerful customers than protecting his own crew. On the floor near Trevor's seat lay the remains of a wine glass and a small serving tray, evidence of whatever altercation had escalated the situation to this point. The other first-class passengers were watching the scene with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable embarrassment to obvious disapproval. But none of them seemed willing to intervene in a situation that clearly required adult leadership. "She deliberately spilled wine on me," Trevor was saying, his words slurred, but his voice carrying the entitled fury of someone who had never been held accountable for his own behavior. "I want her fired, and I want compensation for my ruined suit. Do you know what this jacket cost? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Sarah tried to maintain her professional demeanor despite the obvious stress of the situation. "Sir, I apologize if there was an accident, but you grabbed my wrist when I was trying to clear your glass. I would appreciate it if you would return to your seat so we can resolve this calmly." The revelation that Trevor had physically grabbed Sarah changed everything about the situation, transforming it from a service dispute into a potential assault case. But instead of addressing Trevor's inappropriate physical contact, Captain Hayes continued to focus on protecting the airline's relationship with a politically connected passenger. "Sarah, why don't you go clean up in the galley?" Hayes suggested, his tone implying that she was somehow responsible for the situation. "I'll handle Mr. Blackwood's concerns personally." It was at that moment that Olivia stepped into the first-class cabin, her presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the confrontation. She moved with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of managing crisis situations in corporate boardrooms, her expression revealing nothing of the anger and disgust she felt at watching Hayes enable Trevor's abusive behavior. "Excuse me," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of someone who expected to be heard and taken seriously. "But it sounds like someone needs assistance here." Captain Hayes spun around, his face immediately flushing with anger as he recognized the woman he had humiliated and banished to economy class just hours earlier. The sight of her in his first-class cabin, confident and composed despite his efforts to diminish her, represented a direct challenge to the authority that he had worked so hard to establish and maintain. "Ma'am, you need to return to your assigned seat immediately." Hayes commanded, his voice carrying the same aggressive tone he had used during their earlier confrontation. "You are not authorized to be in this section of the aircraft, and your interference is making this situation worse." Trevor looked between Olivia and Hayes, his alcohol-impaired judgment struggling to process the dynamics of the interaction. "Who is this woman? Why is she even on this plane?" But Olivia wasn't looking at Trevor or Hayes. Her attention was focused entirely on Sarah Chen, whose obvious distress and fear activated every protective instinct that Olivia possessed as both a mother and a leader. "Are you injured?" she asked Sarah directly, ignoring the two men who were demanding her attention. "Did he hurt you?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern and respect, broke through Sarah's professional facade and revealed the scared young woman beneath. "I'm okay," she whispered, but her shaking hands and tear-filled eyes suggested otherwise. "I just want this to stop." And that's when Olivia realized that this moment was about much more than airline seating disputes or customer service failures. This was about power privilege and the way that certain people felt entitled to treat others as objects rather than human beings. It was about the same mentality that had led Hayes to humiliate her, and Maya now manifesting as Trevor's assault on Sarah and Hayes's complicity in protecting the abuser rather than the victim. Maya's voice echoed in her memory. "Mom, shouldn't we help people who are hurt?" Yes, Olivia thought we absolutely should. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become electric with tension, every passenger holding their breath as they watched a confrontation that had escalated far beyond normal airline protocol into something that resembled a powder keg waiting for a spark. Olivia stood in the aisle, her calm presence creating a stark contrast to the chaos and aggression that surrounded her, while Captain Hayes and Trevor Blackwood seemed to feed off each other's anger and entitlement in a way that made the situation increasingly dangerous. "I'm going to ask you one more time to return to your seat," Hayes said, his voice rising to a level that was clearly audible throughout the first-class cabin and probably beyond. "You are in violation of federal aviation regulations. You are interfering with flight crew operations, and if you don't comply immediately, I will have you arrested when we land." Trevor stumbled slightly as he tried to focus on Olivia, his alcohol-impaired coordination making him even more unpredictable and potentially violent. "Yeah, get this woman out of here. She doesn't belong anywhere near first class, and she's obviously just looking for trouble." The casual dismissal in Trevor's voice, combined with Hayes's obvious support for his position, revealed the depth of the prejudice and privilege that both men took for granted. In their minds, Olivia was nothing more than an intruder who had somehow found her way into spaces where she didn't belong, and her attempts to help a crew member in distress were simply further evidence of her inappropriate presence. But Olivia had spent her entire career in rooms where she was the only woman, the only black person, or the only voice of conscience among people who were comfortable with inequality and injustice. She had learned long ago that backing down in the face of intimidation only encouraged more aggressive behavior, while standing firm with calm dignity often revealed the true character of the people she was dealing with. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "You have a crew member who has been physically assaulted by a passenger, and instead of protecting her and ensuring her safety, you're trying to blame her for the incident and remove the only person who has expressed concern for her well-being." The word assault hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung, forcing everyone present to confront the reality of what had actually happened, rather than the sanitized version that Hayes and Trevor were trying to create. Sarah looked up with surprise and gratitude, realizing that someone was finally acknowledging what she had experienced rather than dismissing it as a misunderstanding or service failure. Hayes's face turned a dangerous shade of red as he processed the implications of Olivia's statement. "That is a serious accusation, and I won't have you creating panic and disruption based on your misinterpretation of a minor service issue." "I didn't misinterpret anything," Olivia replied calmly. "Your passenger admitted that he grabbed your crew member's wrist. There's physical evidence of an altercation, and the victim is clearly distressed and frightened. Those are the facts, regardless of how you choose to interpret them. Trevor suddenly seemed to understand that the situation was becoming more serious than he had anticipated, his alcohol-clouded judgment finally registering that terms like assault and victim carried legal implications that his father's political connections might not be able to resolve. Now wait just a minute. I barely touched her, and it was an accident. She spilled wine all over my jacket, and I was just trying to get her attention. By grabbing her wrist, Olivia asked, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of the accusation. Without her consent, while she was trying to do her job after you had been drinking heavily for several hours. The precision of Olivia's questions revealed a legal sophistication that made both Hayes and Trevor increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't just a random passenger causing trouble. This was someone who understood exactly how serious the situation had become and how to frame the facts in ways that would be difficult to dismiss or explain away. Maya's voice suddenly cut through the tension from the economy section, her 8-year-old voice carrying clearly through the aircraft's intercom system. Mom, are you okay? I'm scared." The sound of a frightened child calling for her mother transformed the dynamics of the entire situation, reminding everyone present that this confrontation was taking place in front of families and children who were being exposed to adult conflicts that they shouldn't have to witness. Several passengers pulled out their phones and began recording, realizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become a significant news story. Olivia felt her heart break at the fear in Maya's voice, but she also realized that this was exactly the moment she had been preparing for throughout their conversation in economy class. Maya was watching to see how her mother would respond when faced with injustice and aggression, and the lessons learned in this moment would shape her daughter's understanding of courage, dignity, and moral responsibility for the rest of her life. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Olivia called back, her voice carrying the calm strength that Maya had come to depend on during difficult moments. "I'm helping someone who needs help, just like we talked about. I'll be back with you very soon." Hayes seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, with passengers recording everything and a frightened child adding emotional weight to an already volatile confrontation. "That's enough," he announced, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who knew he was losing control of the narrative. "I'm declaring this a security emergency and diverting the flight to the nearest airport. Everyone will remain in their seats until we can sort this out on the ground." The threat of diversion sent a ripple of concern through the cabin, as passengers began to understand that their 8-hour flight to London might be interrupted by an emergency landing that would cost them time, money, and travel plans. The prospect of being questioned by law enforcement and potentially detained at an unfamiliar airport added a new level of anxiety to an already stressful situation. Trevor seemed to panic at the mention of law enforcement involvement, his political instincts finally overriding his alcohol-impaired judgment. "Captain, there's no need for that. Let's just forget this whole thing happened and get on with the flight. I'm sure we can work something out that satisfies everyone." But Olivia realized that Hayes's threat of diversion was actually the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth about who she was and what she was capable of doing. A forced landing would inconvenience 300 innocent passengers, cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, and create exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that airlines spend enormous amounts of money trying to avoid. More importantly, it would teach Maya and every other passenger on the aircraft that the powerful could disrupt everyone's lives whenever they felt challenged or uncomfortable, while the powerless were expected to absorb abuse and humiliation without complaint or consequence. "Captain Hayes," Olivia said, her voice taking on a tone that commanded attention, and suggested that the conversation was about to take a very different direction. "Before you make any decisions about diverting this flight, there's something you need to know about exactly who you're dealing with." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. her movements deliberate and confident as she prepared to reveal information that would change everything about the power dynamics on Flight MA-2847. My name is Dr. Olivia Rose, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Rose Capital Management. Hayes blinked, clearly not recognizing the name or understanding its significance, but several of the first-class passengers gasped as they made the connection to one of the most successful venture capital firms in the technology industry, Rose Capital Management. Olivia continued, her voice remaining calm, despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, completed the acquisition of Meridian Airways 72 hours ago. Which means, Captain Hayes, that you have just threatened to divert an aircraft that I own after humiliating passengers who are traveling on an airline that belongs to me in order to protect a passenger who assaulted a crew member who works for my company. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the jet engines and the sound of several passengers drawing sharp breaths as they processed the implications of Olivia's revelation. Hayes stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in the hoodie and jeans with the billionaire business leader who now controlled his career, his pension, and his future. Trevor's face went pale as he realized that his assumptions about power and privilege had just been turned completely upside down. The woman he had dismissed as an intruder was actually the person who could make or break his father's political relationships with the aviation industry. And in the economy section, Maya listened to her mother's words with the kind of pride and understanding that only comes from watching someone you love stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier to stay silent. The revelation was complete, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The moment that Olivia revealed her identity, the first-class cabin of Flight MA-2847 transformed into something resembling a courtroom where the judge had just revealed herself to be the defendant's worst nightmare. Captain Hayes stood frozen in the aisle, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, terror, and desperate calculation as his mind tried to process the impossible reality that the woman he had humiliated and dismissed was actually the person who now controlled every aspect of his professional life. Trevor Blackwood swayed slightly, his alcohol-impaired brain struggling to understand how completely his assumptions about power and privilege had just been overturned. The woman he had treated as an intruder and threat was actually someone whose influence could destroy his father's political career with a single phone call to the right transportation industry leaders. But it was the other passengers who provided the most dramatic reaction to Olivia's revelation. Mrs. Patterson, the pharmaceutical heiress, gasped audibly and reached for her phone, clearly recognizing the name Rose Capital Management from financial news reports. Mr. Chang, the investment banker, actually stood up from his seat, his professional instincts telling him that he was witnessing a moment that would reshape the entire aviation industry. "That's impossible," Hayes whispered, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. "You can't be." "I mean, the acquisition wasn't supposed to be announced until Monday morning." Olivia finished for him, her voice remaining calm despite the magnitude of the moment. "The paperwork was filed on Friday afternoon, the due diligence was completed over the weekend, and the transfer of ownership became official at exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday morning, which was approximately 6 hours ago." She pulled her phone from her pocket and showed him the screen, which displayed a secure corporate portal with real-time financial data and ownership documentation that left no doubt about her authority. "Every decision you make on this aircraft, Captain Hayes, every policy you enforce, every passenger you choose to treat with dignity or disrespect reflects directly on my company and my leadership." Sarah Chen, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement, suddenly understood that her nightmare was about to become someone else's problem. The woman who had stepped in to help her wasn't just a concerned passenger. She was literally the person who could fire Captain Hayes and ensure that this kind of incident never happened again. "Dr. Rose," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I had no idea who you were. Thank you for standing up for me when no one else would." Olivia turned toward Sarah with the kind of warm attention that she had been trained to give every crew member from the beginning, but which Hayes had consistently failed to provide throughout his career. "Sarah, you did absolutely nothing wrong. You followed proper protocol for dealing with an intoxicated passenger, you maintained your professionalism under extremely difficult circumstances, and you deserve the full support of your airline's leadership." Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper that revealed just how completely he understood the gravity of his situation. "Dr. Rose, I had no idea. I mean, if I had known who you were." "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently." Olivia interrupted, her tone sharpening as she addressed the heart of the problem. "But Captain Hayes, that's exactly the issue. Your behavior toward me and my daughter wasn't wrong because of who we turned out to be. It was wrong because of who we are as human beings who deserved basic respect and dignity regardless of our appearance or your assumptions about our economic status." The distinction hit Hayes like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his prejudices and discriminatory behavior weren't just policy violations. They were fundamental failures of character that revealed who he truly was when he thought there would be no consequences for his actions. Trevor Blackwood, who had been silent since Olivia's revelation, suddenly seemed to understand that his political connections and family influence were meaningless in this situation. "Dr. Rose, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I was just trying to get good service and things got out of hand." Olivia turned toward Trevor with the kind of cold assessment that had made her legendary in corporate boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made based on character judgments and risk analysis. "Mr. Blackwood, you physically grabbed a crew member without her consent. You threatened her job security when she tried to follow proper alcohol service protocols, and you caused property damage while creating a hostile work environment for airline employees." The clinical precision with which she listed his offenses made it clear that Olivia wasn't interested in excuses or political influence. She was documenting facts that would have legal and professional consequences regardless of who Trevor's father happened to be. Those actions constitute assault, workplace harassment, and destruction of airline property. She continued, her voice remaining conversational despite the severity of the charges she was outlining. "The fact that you think those behaviors can be excused as misunderstandings tells me everything I need to know about your character and your fitness to represent your family's political interests." Mr. Chang, the investment banker, had been recording the entire interaction on his phone, his financial instincts telling him that he was witnessing a defining moment that would become a case study in business schools and corporate leadership programs for years to come. The way that Olivia was handling the situation, with calm authority, precise legal reasoning, and genuine concern for her employees, was exactly the kind of leadership that investors looked for when evaluating companies worth billions of dollars. Hayes made one last desperate attempt to salvage his career, his voice carrying the pleading tone of someone who finally understood that his actions had consequences that his seniority and union protection couldn't shield him from. "Dr. Rose, I've been flying for Meridian Airways for 28 years. I have an excellent safety record, and I've never had any serious incidents in my entire career." "Captain Hayes," Olivia replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had made difficult personnel decisions throughout her career and understood the difference between technical competence and leadership character. "Your technical flying skills were never in question, but your judgment, your professionalism, and your ability to treat all passengers and crew members with basic human dignity have been thoroughly demonstrated in the past 4 hours." She gestured toward Sarah, who was still visibly shaking from her encounter with Trevor's aggression. "You have a crew member who was assaulted by a passenger, and instead of protecting her and enforcing appropriate conduct standards, you chose to blame her and enable her attacker because of his political connections." The truth of Olivia's assessment hung in the air like an indictment that no amount of technical expertise could overcome. Hayes had revealed himself to be someone who prioritized wealth and power over justice and human dignity, exactly the kind of leadership that Olivia had spent her career working to eliminate from the organizations she controlled. From the economy section, Maya's voice carried clearly through the aircraft's intercom system as she spoke to Harold Wilson. "Mr. Harold, my mom says that when people make mistakes, they have to learn from them so they can be better. Do you think the pilot man will learn to be better?" The innocent question from an 8-year-old girl cut through all the adult posturing and legal complexities to the heart of what this moment was really about. Whether people could change, grow, and become better than they had been when faced with the consequences of their actions. Olivia looked at Hayes and Trevor, seeing not just the prejudice and entitlement that had brought them to this moment, but also the possibility for transformation that existed if they were willing to acknowledge their failures and commit to genuine change. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the time for excuses and explanations was over. "You have a choice to make. You can continue to defend your behavior and face the full legal and professional consequences of your actions. Or you can take responsibility for what you've done and begin the hard work of becoming the kind of people who deserve the trust and authority you've been given." The choice was theirs, but the consequences were no longer under their control. The remainder of Flight MA-2847 passed in a state of suspended tension that affected every passenger on board, from the first-class travelers who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand to the economy passengers who understood that something historic was unfolding in the premium cabin. Captain Hayes had been relieved of his duties and relegated to a passenger seat, while First Officer Patricia Wong took command of the aircraft with a professionalism and competence that revealed just how unnecessary Hayes's authoritarian leadership style had actually been. Patricia Wong represented everything that the airline industry could become under different leadership. Technically excellent, collaborative rather than dictatorial, and focused on the safety and comfort of everyone on board rather than just the passengers who could afford premium accommodations. As she guided the Boeing 777 across the Atlantic, her calm voice on the intercom provided regular updates that were informative without being condescending, professional without being intimidating. Trevor Blackwood spent the remaining 5 hours of the flight in what could only be described as a state of shock, his alcohol gradually wearing off to reveal the full magnitude of his legal and political problems. Sarah Chen had filed a formal complaint that would result in assault charges being filed by London Metropolitan Police upon landing, while Olivia had made it clear that Meridian Airways would prosecute the case to the full extent of the law, regardless of any political pressure that Senator Blackwood might attempt to apply. But the most dramatic change was in the atmosphere throughout the aircraft as passengers began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical airline incident. Word of Olivia's identity had spread through the economy cabin via whispered conversations and text messages, transforming her from a victim of discrimination into a symbol of justice and accountability that resonated with every passenger who had ever been treated poorly by airline staff or fellow travelers. Maya had become something of a celebrity in the economy section, her innocent questions and mature observations earning the admiration of passengers who recognized her as the child whose dignity had been protected by her mother's courage. Harold Wilson had taken on an unofficial grandfather role, keeping Maya entertained with stories and games while Olivia handled the legal and corporate implications of the incident. "Mr. Harold," Maya said during one of their conversations, "my mom says that when something bad happens, we can choose to make something good come out of it. Do you think something good will happen because of what that pilot man did to us?" Harold smiled at the wisdom in Maya's question, recognizing that she was already thinking about justice and transformation in ways that many adults never manage to achieve. "I think your mom is going to make sure that other children never have to go through what you experienced today, sweetheart. And that's definitely something good." As London Heathrow Airport came into view through the aircraft windows, Olivia completed a series of phone calls that would set in motion the most comprehensive reform initiative in commercial aviation history. Her legal team was preparing documentation for criminal charges against Trevor Blackwood, while her human resources department was conducting emergency reviews of every discrimination complaint that had been filed against Meridian Airways employees over the past 5 years. But more importantly, she had authorized the immediate implementation of new policies that would transform how Meridian Airways approached customer service, employee protection, and corporate accountability. Every crew member would receive comprehensive bias training. Every passenger complaint would be investigated by independent third parties, and every incident of discrimination would result in immediate termination regardless of seniority or union protection. The landing at Heathrow was flawless. Patricia Wong's technical skills proving that leadership and competence had nothing to do with the aggressive posturing and discriminatory behavior that Hayes had mistaken for authority. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers could see through the windows that an unusual reception was waiting for them. London Metropolitan Police officers, Meridian Airways management personnel, and what appeared to be a significant media presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Wong from the flight deck." Patricia's voice carried the calm professionalism that had characterized her command of the aircraft. "We have arrived safely at London Heathrow, where the local time is 2:30 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." Ish. The pause that followed was pregnant with significance, as everyone on board understood that the normal routine of aircraft deplaning was about to be interrupted by procedures that none of them had ever experienced before. "We will have some additional personnel boarding the aircraft before general deplaning begins," Patricia continued, "as we address some incidents that occurred during the flight. We appreciate your patience and cooperation as we ensure that all passengers and crew members are treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve." As the aircraft reached the gate, Olivia gathered her belongings and prepared Maya for what would undoubtedly be a chaotic and overwhelming experience. "Sweetheart, there are going to be a lot of people who want to talk to us when we get off the plane. Some of them are police officers who need to hear about what happened, and some of them are reporters who want to tell our story to other people." Maya nodded solemnly, processing this information with the maturity that she had developed through her experience of witnessing adult conflicts and injustices. "Are we going to be in trouble, Mom?" "No, Maya, we're not in trouble," Olivia assured her, gathering her daughter into a protective embrace. "But some other people are going to have to answer for the choices they made today, and we're going to help make sure that other families don't have to go through what we experienced." When the aircraft door opened, the first people to board were London Metropolitan Police officers, who moved directly to escort Trevor Blackwood off the plane in custody. The sight of a senator's son being arrested for assault created exactly the kind of media spectacle that would force a national conversation about privilege, accountability, and the way that wealthy and powerful individuals were treated differently by institutions that should apply the same standards to everyone. Hayes was next to be escorted off the aircraft, though he was not in police custody. Instead, he was met by Meridian Airways management personnel who informed him that he was suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. The revocation of his credentials, his removal from the flight schedule, and his exclusion from all airline property would be effective immediately pending the outcome of formal disciplinary proceedings. But the most significant moment came when Olivia and Maya finally deplaned, walking into a scene that resembled a major political or entertainment event rather than a typical airline arrival. Reporters shouted questions about discrimination in the aviation industry. Photographers captured images that would appear on front pages around the world, and corporate representatives from multiple airlines waited to hear how the incident would affect industry-wide policies and practices. Sarah Chen walked beside them, her presence serving as a powerful symbol of the employee protection and empowerment that Olivia intended to implement throughout her airline operations. The young flight attendant who had been assaulted and blamed for a passenger's criminal behavior was now standing next to the CEO, who would ensure that such incidents never happened again without swift and decisive consequences. "Dr. Rose," shouted a reporter from the BBC, "what changes will you be making at Meridian Airways as a result of today's incident?" Olivia paused Maya's hand in hers as she prepared to make a statement that would set the tone for everything that would follow. Today's incident revealed problems that go far beyond one airline or one flight crew. We have an opportunity to demonstrate that the aviation industry can be better than it has been, and that dignity and respect are not luxury amenities that only some passengers deserve. She looked down at Maya, whose presence served as a reminder that every policy decision and corporate action would affect children and families who simply wanted to travel safely and be treated with basic human courtesy. "My daughter asked me earlier whether something good could come from something bad," Olivia continued, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had spent her career transforming challenges into opportunities. "I believe that what happened on Flight M, A2847 today will become a turning point for how the airline industry treats all passengers and crew members regardless of their appearance, background, or economic status." The questions and cameras would continue for hours, but the real work of transformation was just beginning. 3 weeks after Flight M, A2847 landed at Heathrow. Olivia found herself sitting in a conference room at the London offices of Meridian Airways, facing the most unlikely conversation of her professional career. Across from her sat Captain Richard Hayes, his face bearing the weight of someone who had spent every day since the flight examining his own prejudices and confronting the reality of how his actions had affected other people. The room was carefully arranged to facilitate dialogue rather than confrontation, with comfortable seating, natural lighting, and the presence of Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who specialized in helping families process traumatic experiences and complex social issues. Maya sat beside her mother, her presence serving as both a reminder of what was at stake and a bridge toward the kind of understanding that only children seemed capable of achieving. Hayes had voluntarily entered a comprehensive diversity and bias training program, working with civil rights organizations to understand the historical and social context that had shaped his attitudes toward race and class. The process had been painful and humbling, forcing him to confront not just his conscious prejudices, but the unconscious assumptions that had guided his behavior throughout his career. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Foster began, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had facilitated thousands of difficult conversations, "can you tell us what you've learned about your behavior on the flight and how it affected Maya and Dr. Rose?" Hayes looked directly at Maya, his eyes showing a vulnerability that would have been impossible to imagine during their first encounter. "Maya, I want you to know that what I did to you and your mother was wrong. I made judgments about you based on how you looked instead of who you are as people, and I treated you in a way that no child should ever be treated." Maya listened with the serious attention that she brought to all important adult conversations, her 8-year-old mind processing concepts of apology and accountability that would shape her understanding of justice for the rest of her life. "Mr. Hayes, why did you think we didn't belong in the nice seats? We had the right tickets, and we weren't being mean to anyone." The directness of Maya's question cut through all the adult complexities of bias training and corporate policies to the heart of what had actually happened. Hayes took a deep breath, preparing to give an answer that acknowledged his failures without trying to excuse them. "Maya, I grew up thinking that certain people belonged in certain places, and I never questioned those ideas until I had to face what they made me do to you and your mom," he said slowly. "I thought that being the captain gave me the right to decide who deserved respect, but I was wrong. Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and fairness no matter what they look like or where they come from." Olivia had been watching the exchange with the analytical mind that had made her successful in business, but also with the protective instincts of a mother who wanted to ensure that Maya was processing this experience in ways that would help her rather than harm her. "Maya, what do you think about what Mr. Hayes just said?" Maya considered the question with the careful thoughtfulness that characterized all her responses to complex situations. "I think he's telling the truth now, but I wish he had been telling the truth before when we were on the airplane. The simple honesty of Maya's response revealed both her capacity for forgiveness and her clear understanding that actions have consequences that can't be erased simply through apologies. It was exactly the kind of moral clarity that Olivia had hoped to preserve throughout this process. Doctor. Foster turned toward Olivia, recognizing that the success of this dialogue depended as much on the victim's willingness to engage as on the perpetrator's willingness to change. Dr. Rose, how has this experience affected you and Maya, and what would meaningful accountability look like from your perspective? Olivia had been thinking about this question since the moment Hayes approached their seats 3 weeks earlier, balancing her desire for justice with her commitment to demonstrating the values she wanted Maya to learn. Dr. Foster, what happened to us was wrong, but it was also an opportunity to show Maya that people can choose to respond to injustice in ways that create positive change, rather than simply perpetuating cycles of anger and retaliation. She looked directly at Hayes, her expression showing neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but rather the kind of measured assessment that she would apply to any business decision. Mr. Hayes has lost his job and his reputation because of his choices. But more importantly, he has the opportunity to use this experience to help other people recognize and change their own biases before they cause similar harm. Hayes nodded, understanding that Olivia was offering him a path toward redemption that would require genuine commitment and ongoing work rather than simple expressions of remorse. Dr. Rose, I want to spend the rest of my career making sure that no other child experiences what Maya went through because of my prejudices. I know I can't undo what I did, but I can use it to help other people be better. Maya looked between her mother and Hayes, her young mind grappling with concepts of forgiveness, justice, and transformation that most adults struggled to understand. Mom, does this mean that Mr. Hayes won't be mean to other people anymore? That's up to Mr. Hayes, sweetheart, Olivia replied, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of teachable moment that could shape Maya's understanding of personal responsibility and moral courage. People can change if they really want to, but they have to choose to do the hard work of becoming better. Dr. Foster facilitated a conversation that lasted for nearly 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from the psychology of bias to the importance of institutional accountability to the way that children process experiences of discrimination. By the end of the session, something had shifted in the room. Not complete forgiveness or total trust, but a foundation for the kind of understanding that could lead to genuine change. Hayes had committed to working with Meridian Airways' new diversity and inclusion program, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale for other airline employees who might harbor similar prejudices. He would undergo regular training and evaluation with his continued employment contingent on demonstrating genuine change rather than simply avoiding further incidents. More importantly, he had agreed to establish a scholarship fund for minority youth interested in aviation careers, using his savings and pension to create opportunities for young people who looked like Maya to enter an industry that had historically excluded them. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Maya approached Hayes with the kind of direct honesty that only children possess. Mr. Hayes, I forgive you for being mean to us, but you have to promise to be nice to everyone from now on. Hayes knelt to Maya's eye level, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that he was making a commitment that would define the rest of his life. I promise, Maya, and if I ever forget that promise, I want you to remind me. The transformation wasn't complete. Genuine change takes time and ongoing effort. But the foundation had been established for something that neither Olivia nor Hayes could have imagined when their confrontation began a partnership in creating the kind of airline industry that would treat every passenger and crew member with dignity and respect. 6 months after Flight M, A2847 Meridian Airways had become unrecognizable from the airline that had allowed Captain Hayes to humiliate passengers and enable assault without consequences. The transformation had been swift, comprehensive, and so successful that other airlines began studying Meridian's new policies as a model for industry-wide reform that addressed decades of discrimination and poor treatment that had been accepted as normal parts of air travel. Sarah Chen stood at the podium in Meridian Airways training facility, addressing a classroom full of new flight attendants with the confidence and authority of someone whose voice had been heard and valued by her company's leadership. Her promotion to Chief of Cabin Safety and Inclusion had made her the youngest person ever to hold such a senior position at a major airline, but her experience on Flight M, A2847, had given her insights into passenger and crew dynamics that no amount of traditional training could provide. Customer service isn't about treating people differently based on how much money they paid for their tickets, Sarah explained to the trainees, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned these lessons through personal experience. It's about recognizing the humanity and dignity of every person who trusts us with their safety and comfort, whether they're sitting in first class or economy. The training program that Sarah was leading had been developed in partnership with Dr. Amanda Foster and implemented across every Meridian Airways facility worldwide. It combined traditional customer service skills with comprehensive bias awareness training, conflict resolution techniques, and clear protocols for addressing discrimination and harassment from passengers or crew members. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the new training was the presence of Richard Hayes as a co-instructor, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale and demonstrating the transformation that was possible when people took responsibility for their prejudices and committed to genuine change. Hayes had spent the past 6 months in what could only be described as a complete life reconstruction, working with civil rights organizations, attending bias training workshops, and volunteering at youth aviation programs in underserved communities. The work had been humbling and difficult, forcing him to confront not just his conscious prejudices, but the unconscious assumptions that had shaped his worldview for 52 years. "I want you to understand something," Hayes told the new flight attendants, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lost everything because of his biases and was now working to ensure that others didn't make the same mistakes. "I convinced myself that my prejudices were really about maintaining standards and protecting the airline's reputation. But what I was actually doing was creating hostile environments for passengers and crew members who didn't look like me or fit my narrow definition of who belonged in certain spaces." The presence of a former captain acknowledging his discriminatory behavior and actively working to prevent others from repeating his mistakes sent a powerful message throughout the airline industry. Hayes had become a symbol of the possibility for redemption and transformation, but also a reminder of the real consequences that followed when prejudice was allowed to masquerade as professionalism. Maya Rose had also become an unexpected figure in the airline industry's transformation, though in a very different way than anyone could have anticipated. Her innocent questions and observations during the crisis had inspired Meridian Airways to create the Young Travelers Ambassador program, which trained children to recognize unfair treatment and gave them tools to report problems to airline staff in age-appropriate ways. The program had proven remarkably effective, as children often noticed discriminatory behavior that adults either missed or chose to ignore. Flight attendants reported that young passengers were helping to create more inclusive environments simply by asking questions like, "Why is that person being treated differently?" or "Shouldn't everyone get help with their bags?" Dr. Olivia Rose stood in the Meridian Airways boardroom reviewing quarterly reports that showed the remarkable success of the airline's transformation initiative. Customer satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in company history. Employee retention had improved dramatically, and discrimination complaints had dropped by 93% compared to the previous year. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of success was in the letters and emails that arrived daily from passengers who had experienced the new Meridian Airways culture. Families who felt welcomed and respected crew members who felt supported and empowered, and travelers who had chosen Meridian specifically because of its commitment to dignity and inclusion. "Mom, look at this," Maya said, pointing to a framed letter hanging on the wall of Olivia's office. The letter was from a young black girl who had flown Meridian Airways with her grandmother and wanted to thank the airline for making her feel special and important during her first flight. "She reminds me of you when you were on that airplane with the mean pilot." Maya continued her 9-year-old perspective, providing insights that no corporate consultant could offer. But she didn't have to be scared or sad because the airplane people were nice to her. That was exactly what Olivia had hoped to achieve. An airline where children like Maya could travel without fear of discrimination, where families could focus on their journeys rather than worrying about unfair treatment, and where every passenger received the respect and dignity that should be basic human rights rather than luxury amenities. The transformation had extended beyond Meridian Airways, as well as other airlines faced pressure from passengers, employees, and investors to adopt similar policies and training programs. The Meridian Standard had become shorthand for comprehensive anti-discrimination policies that prioritized employee empowerment and passenger dignity over traditional hierarchies and profit maximization. Industry publications had featured extensive coverage of the changes, with particular attention to the way that Meridian Airways had transformed a crisis into an opportunity for positive change. Business schools began teaching case studies about Olivia's leadership during the flight MA2847 incident, analyzing her decision to choose transformation over retaliation as a model for corporate responsibility and ethical decision-making. Trevor Blackwood had also undergone his own transformation, though his journey had been more complicated and legally fraught than Hayes' redemption arc. His conviction for assault had resulted in community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and probation that required him to complete bias awareness training similar to what Hayes had experienced. More significantly, his father, Senator Blackwood, had used the incident as motivation for comprehensive aviation civil rights legislation that strengthened protections for passengers and crew members while creating federal oversight mechanisms for discrimination complaints. The senator had acknowledged that his son's behavior reflected poorly on their family's commitment to equality and justice and had chosen to channel that embarrassment into policy changes that would benefit millions of travelers. As Olivia reviewed the progress reports and transformation metrics, she felt a satisfaction that went beyond financial success or industry recognition. Maya was growing up in a world where her questions about fairness and dignity were being taken seriously by adults who had the power to create change, where her experience of discrimination had become a catalyst for protecting other children from similar treatment. The little girl who had asked, "Why didn't you like us?" had helped create an airline industry that was finally learning to answer that question honestly and work toward better solutions. 1 year to the day after Flight MA2847, Olivia and Maya found themselves once again at JFK Airport preparing to board the same route to London Heathrow. But everything about their experience was different this time, starting with the way they were greeted by Meridian Airways staff, who recognized them not as VIPs to be treated differently, but as passengers whose previous experience had helped transform the airline into something better. Maya, now 9 years old and significantly more sophisticated about airline operations and corporate leadership, had insisted on flying the anniversary route to see how much had changed since their traumatic experience the previous year. "Mom, do you think Mr. Hayes will be there? And do you think the airplane will feel different now?" The questions reflected Maya's understanding that their flight hadn't just been a travel inconvenience. It had been a catalyst for changes that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers across the entire aviation industry. She had become something of a celebrity among airline industry professionals, her innocent observations and mature questions serving as reminders of why customer service policies mattered beyond profit margins and efficiency metrics. As they approached the gate for Flight MA2847, the same flight number had been deliberately retained as a symbol of transformation rather than something to be forgotten. They were greeted by Patricia Wong, who had been promoted to chief pilot following Hayes' departure and the airline's commitment to promoting leadership based on competence and character rather than seniority and traditional hierarchies. "Dr. Rose Maya," Patricia said warmly, her presence representing the new face of airline leadership that prioritized collaboration and respect over authoritarian control. "It's wonderful to see you again under much better circumstances. I understand this is an important anniversary for both of you." Maya beamed with excitement at seeing Patricia again, her memories of the competent first officer who had safely completed their flight serving as a positive counterpoint to the trauma of Hayes' discriminatory behavior. "Captain Patricia, are you going to be flying our airplane today? Mom said you're the captain now because you're really good at your job." "I am indeed flying today's flight," Patricia confirmed, kneeling to Maya's eye level with the kind of respectful attention that had become standard practice for all Meridian Airways employees when interacting with young passengers. "And I want you to know that we've worked very hard to make sure that every passenger on our flights feels welcome and respected, just like you deserve to feel." The boarding process itself demonstrated the comprehensive changes that Meridian Airways had implemented over the past year. Instead of the traditional hierarchy that prioritized first-class passengers over everyone else, the airline had adopted a system that boarded families with young children first, followed by passengers with special needs or mobility requirements. Then everyone else, in a process that minimized stress and confusion while treating all travelers with equal consideration. As they walked through the jet bridge, Maya noticed Richard Hayes waiting near the aircraft door wearing a Meridian Airways training instructor uniform instead of a captain's stripes. His presence was part of the airline's commitment to using real experiences as teaching opportunities, but it also represented his personal journey toward redemption and meaningful contribution to the industry he had once disgraced. "Maya," Hayes said softly, his voice carrying a humility and warmth that would have been impossible to imagine during their first encounter. "I want to thank you for helping me learn to be a better person. The things you said to me and the questions you asked made me understand how much I needed to change." Maya looked at Hayes with the kind of direct assessment that only children can deliver, evaluating his sincerity and transformation with an honesty that was both generous and uncompromising. "Mr. Hayes, are you really different now? Or are you just being nice because my mom owns the airplane company?" The question cut straight to the heart of genuine versus performative change, forcing Hayes to demonstrate the authenticity of his transformation rather than simply claiming it. "Maya, I'm different because I learned that treating people badly because of how they look or where they come from is wrong, and it hurts people in ways that I never understood before. Your mom owning the company didn't teach me that. You did by asking me questions that made me think about how my actions affected other people." Olivia watched the interaction with the kind of careful attention that she had learned to apply to all situations involving Maya's emotional and psychological development. The conversation represented a crucial test of whether Hayes' transformation was genuine and whether Maya had processed their traumatic experience in ways that would help her rather than harm her as she continued to grow and encounter other examples of injustice and prejudice. "I believe you," Maya said, finally, her voice carrying the kind of forgiveness that can only come from someone who has been hurt but chooses to trust again. "But you have to keep being nice to everyone, not just to people like us." "I promise," Hayes replied, his commitment carrying the weight of someone who understood that this 9-year-old girl would be watching and evaluating his behavior for years to come. As they settled into their seats, the same 1A and 1B that had been the source of so much conflict the previous year, Maya marveled at how different the atmosphere felt in the first-class cabin. The other passengers included the same kinds of wealthy business travelers and politically connected individuals who had been present during the original incident, but their behavior and the crew's responses reflected the cultural transformation that had occurred throughout the airline. Sarah Chen, now wearing the insignia of her senior position, approached their seats with the confidence and authority of someone whose voice mattered within the company hierarchy. Dr. Rose Maya. Welcome back to Flight MA2847. I want you to know that this flight has become a symbol throughout our company of our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Harold Wilson, the elderly gentleman who had befriended Maya during their exile to economy class, was seated in first class as well. His upgrade courtesy of Olivia's decision to provide him with lifetime premium travel benefits as a thank you for his kindness during their difficult experience. His presence served as a reminder that true courtesy and human decency had nothing to do with wealth or social status. "Maya," Harold said with the same grandfatherly warmth that had comforted her during their darkest moments. "I heard you've become quite the aviation industry expert. Are you planning to become a pilot when you grow up?" Maya considered the question with the seriousness that she brought to all discussions about her future plans. "Maybe, Mr. Harold. But if I do, I want to be the kind of pilot who makes sure that all the passengers feel safe and welcome, not just the ones who pay extra money for fancy seats." As Flight MA2847 pushed back from the gate and headed toward the runway, Patricia Wong's voice came over the intercom with the kind of warm professionalism that had become the new standard for Meridian Airways communications. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight MA2847 to London Heathrow. This flight holds special significance for our airline as we celebrate 1 year of our commitment to treating every passenger and crew member with the dignity and respect that everyone deserves." The announcement represented more than corporate messaging. It was a public acknowledgement that the airline had learned from its mistakes and was committed to ongoing improvement rather than simply moving past an embarrassing incident. As the aircraft lifted off from JFK and headed out over the Atlantic, Olivia reflected on the transformation that had begun with humiliation and fear but had evolved into something that she had never expected. A partnership between her family and an airline industry that was finally learning to live up to its potential for connecting people and cultures with respect and dignity. Maya fell asleep against her mother's shoulder, her peaceful expression reflecting a comfort and security that had been impossible during their traumatic flight the previous year. This time, there were no tears, no confusion, and no fear. Just the quiet satisfaction of watching people and institutions become better than they had been. 2 years after Flight MA2847, the aviation industry had been transformed so completely that new employees often found it difficult to believe the discriminatory practices and hostile environments that had been considered normal just a few years earlier. The Meridian Standard had become federal law with comprehensive anti-discrimination requirements that applied to every commercial airline operating in the United States, while international aviation authorities had adopted similar policies based on the success of the American model. Dr. Olivia Rose stood at the podium of the International Aviation Leadership Conference preparing to deliver the keynote address to an audience that included airline executives, government regulators, and civil rights advocates from around the world. But the most important person in the audience was Maya, now 11 years old, and serving as a youth advisor to several airline industry committees that sought her perspective on family travel policies and anti-discrimination initiatives. 3 years ago, Olivia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had transformed an industry through principled leadership rather than aggressive confrontation. "My daughter and I experienced treatment on a commercial airline that no family should ever have to endure. We were humiliated, discriminated against, and taught that our dignity was less important than the prejudices of people in positions of authority." The audience listened with complete attention, most of them familiar with the story, but understanding that they were hearing from someone who had chosen transformation over retaliation in ways that had benefited millions of travelers around the world. "But what happened next taught us something even more important than the reality of discrimination and privilege," Olivia continued. "It showed us that institutions and individuals can change, that people can learn from their mistakes, and that children often understand justice and fairness better than the adults who are supposed to be teaching them. Maya smiled from her seat in the front row, her presence serving as a reminder of why these policies and transformations mattered beyond corporate profits and industry reputation. At 11 years old, she had become a powerful advocate for fair treatment and equal dignity, her questions and observations continuing to guide policy decisions at Meridian Airways and other companies throughout the industry. Richard Hayes sat in the middle section of the auditorium, his presence representing one of the most remarkable transformation stories in corporate America. His journey from prejudiced pilot to nationally recognized diversity trainer had become a case study in business schools and civil rights organizations, demonstrating that redemption was possible for people who were willing to do the difficult work of examining their biases and changing their behavior. His scholarship fund for minority youth in aviation had provided opportunities for over 200 young people to pursue careers as pilots, mechanics, and airline managers, creating a pipeline of diverse talent that was changing the face of an industry that had been overwhelmingly white and male for most of its history. The real measure of our success, Olivia continued, isn't in the policies we've written or the training programs we've implemented. It's in the children who can now travel with their families without fear of discrimination. The employees who can do their jobs without enabling harassment or abuse, and the millions of passengers who are discovering that air travel can be an experience that affirms human dignity rather than diminishing it. Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to Vice President of Customer Experience for Meridian Airways, listened from the VIP section with pride in how far she had come from the nervous young flight attendant who had been assaulted and blamed for a passenger's criminal behavior. Her leadership had been instrumental in developing industry-wide protocols for protecting crew members and empowering them to address discrimination and harassment without fear of retaliation. The conference concluded with the announcement of the Maya Rose Award for Young Advocates, a recognition program that would honor children and teenagers who demonstrated leadership in promoting equality and justice in their communities. Maya herself would serve on the selection committee, her experience having taught her to recognize courage and moral clarity in others who faced unfair treatment. As the audience gave a standing ovation, Olivia looked out at the faces of people who had dedicated their careers to making travel safer, fairer, and more dignified for everyone. The transformation that had begun with a humiliating confrontation in Seat 1, A, had evolved into a movement that was changing not just the aviation industry, but the way that corporations thought about their responsibilities to employees and customers. Hayes approached the stage as the applause died down, his presence representing the possibility for redemption that had become central to Meridian Airways' approach to addressing past mistakes while building a better future. Dr. Rose. He said, his voice carrying the humility and gratitude of someone who understood that his second chance had come through the grace of people he had wronged. I want to thank you and Maya for teaching me that accountability doesn't end with apologies. It begins with them. Maya joined them on the stage, her young voice carrying a wisdom that had been earned through experience rather than taught through lectures. Mr. Hayes, I'm proud of you for learning to be better. And I'm proud of my mom for showing everyone that when something bad happens, you can choose to make something good come out of it. The simple statement captured everything that the transformation had been about. The choice to respond to injustice with determination to create positive change rather than simply seeking revenge or compensation. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the airline industry, demonstrating that individuals and institutions could choose to become better than they had been when confronted with their failures and given opportunities for growth. As the conference ended and participants began planning implementations of the new standards and policies that had been discussed, Olivia and Maya prepared to board their flight home. On Meridian Airways, Flight 2847, of course, which had become a symbol of transformation and hope for travelers around the world. The crew that greeted them represented the new face of commercial aviation. Diverse, professional, and committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Captain Patricia Wong was at the controls, her leadership style serving as a model for collaborative rather than authoritarian command. Sarah Chen was training the next generation of customer service professionals who understood that their job was to affirm rather than diminish human dignity. And Richard Hayes was in the cabin as well, not as the captain who had once abused his authority, but as a mentor and educator who helped other airline employees recognize and address their own biases before those prejudices could cause harm to passengers or colleagues. As Flight 2847 lifted off and headed home, Maya looked out the window at the world below and asked the question that had started it all. "Mom, do you think everyone on airplanes feels safe and welcome now?" Olivia considered the question with the same honesty that she had always brought to her conversations with Maya about fairness, justice, and human dignity. "Not everyone, sweetheart, and probably not everywhere. But we've made it so much better than it was, and we've shown people that change is possible when we're willing to do the hard work of becoming better than we used to be." Maya smiled, satisfied with an answer that acknowledged both the progress that had been made and the work that still remained to be done. "Good. I want other kids to feel as safe as I do now when I fly on airplanes." And that, Olivia thought, was exactly the legacy that their traumatic experience had created. Not just better policies or corporate procedures, but a world where children could travel with confidence that their dignity would be respected and their humanity would be affirmed, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. The transformation was complete, but the commitment to justice and equality would continue for as long as there were people like Maya asking the right questions, and adults like Olivia willing to do the difficult work of creating positive change from moments of crisis and confrontation. If this story of transformation and justice resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Have you ever witnessed discrimination being transformed into positive change? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can continue building a world where dignity and respect are universal rights rather than privileges. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our stories about courage, transformation, and the power of choosing hope over hatred. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next inspiring story of justice and redemption.